Hey, IB History Scholars, it's Mr. Newcomb here, and I would like to continue with the discussion here of the U.S. Civil War. In this particular episode here, I want to focus on the war itself as well as the role of foreign powers in our Civil War here. Moving on to the war itself, you can see on this particular slide there's some red and blue. Red referencing the Confederacy, the blue representing the United States. You can see that there's a little bit more blue than red, and that also references that as the war progresses, it's going to be more to the advantage of the United States because of the manpower, the resources, the political system. The United States is going to be able to fight a longer war than the Confederacy. The Confederacy will have some early success, mainly because they are perhaps geared towards a quick war. They don't necessarily have the resources and the manpower that the United States has, so that's why they can have that early success, but in the long run, that's going to work against them. You can also see on the slide too that there are some italicized conflicts, and that is making reference to some pretty important moments in the war, defining moments, changing objectives, changing the mission, signifying that the end is near. So I'll take a little bit more time to focus on those. But early on, definitely the Confederacy is going to have some success. The Trent Affair, the First Bull Run, the Peninsular Campaign, and the Second Bull Run. All those are really going to represent uh, um, the the nature of the conflict that the Confederacy is attempting to do here. When we look at the Trent Affair, the Confederacy realized that they need to get foreign resources, foreign involvement, and so they had sent two ministers to Great Britain, but the United States had intercepted that ship and captured those two ministers and held them prisoner. The British objected to it, threatened war, and the United States turned over the ministers so they could continue on their mission to Great Britain. They didn't get the recognition that they were hoping for, but they were able to secure some resources for the Confederacy. The First Bull Run represents the first big land conflict between the United States and the Confederacy. It was a Confederate victory here. They caught the United States, one could say, disorganized, even though they may have had more resources or more manpower than the Confederacy here. Perhaps the Union general had put his armed forces in the field too soon. At the end of the day, though, the Confederacy had won, and so that gave them momentum. The Peninsular Campaign shows Robert E. Lee's brilliance, and I had talked about that earlier in a previous recording. And it definitely does show his brilliance in being able to outflank McClellan and utilize his resources to really defeat a larger force. But McClellan for the United States was a very cautious general, so Robert Lee was able to capitalize on that. The next big conflict is going to be the Second Bull Run. Occurred at the same place in Virginia as the first Bull Run. A little fun fact here is the Confederates, they tend to refer to their battles after cities, so they refer to this one as the Battle of Manassas, where the United States typically will name their battles after a geographic feature or also a city, and that's why it's called Bull Run from the United States Union um, perspective here. The Second Bull Run is important in that Lee scores again another victory here, and this time it's against General Pope, and from that victory it gives the Confederacy the courage to take the fight into U.S. territory. In this case, they're going to try to bring it into Maryland and hope a victory there would secure their independence, secure foreign recognition, and secure some resources. So that sets up the next conflict here, which is Antietam, 1862, and this one is an italicized one, and this was in blue, so that means it's a U.S. victory here. Robert E. Lee brings the Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland, hoping to catch the United States by surprise. However, the United States was able to meet Robert E. Lee at Antietam, which the Confederates call Sharpsburg, because Robert E. Lee's plans had been discovered. McClellan was able to get a hold of those plans and catch Robert E. Lee at Antietam. Scores really a first big victory against the Confederacy here. It is a game changer in that Robert E. Lee is forced to go back to Virginia. And so this is an early defeat for Robert E. Lee. For the Confederacy, it's a setback for them. They're not going to get that foreign recognition here, as well as a sense of legitimacy for their cause for the United States. Again, I said it's a big victory. It's a morale boost, and it gives Abraham Lincoln the courage to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which is going to, it's a war measure, so it's going to liberate slaves in rebel territory that still is fighting against the United States. So it's not a complete emancipation of all of the slaves. Ultimately, for that to happen, the 13th Amendment is going to have to get passed here. The next conflict here is Fredericksburg, 1862, and this is another new Union general here is going up against Robert E. Lee. This time it's Burnside. Same results here as some of the previous generals. Shows up at Fredericksburg, has a larger army, more resources, but Robert E. Lee once again shows his tactics, knocks out Burnside at Fredericksburg, and gives some momentum back to the Confederacy after they lost it at Antietam. At Chancellorsville in 1863, this one is a big victory for the Confederates as well, in that very much like the Second Bull Run, it's going to give them courage to go on up into Union territory and see if they can accomplish the tasks that they couldn't at Antietam. At Chancellorsville, Lee does defeat, once again, a new general for the United States here, and that's General Hooker. Hooker, once again, had more resources, more manpower, and still found himself, like Burnside and McClellan and Pope before, on the losing side. And for the Confederates, though, yeah, they're going to be eventually going up into Union territory, but they lost a big general. The General Stonewall Jackson was killed in this conflict, and so that was a big blow for Lee. Okay. The next conflict I have on there is Monitor versus Merrimack, and I have its technology, and this is an example of a conflict between two ironclads, right, which are new naval ships that have been set up. Fun fact here, what really initiates this conflict between the Monitor and the Merrimack, and the Monitor is the United States and the Merrimack is the Confederacy, is that the Merrimack was pursuing a U.S. naval ship, the USS Minnesota, and the Minnesota had run aground, and the Merrimack was setting up to take it down, and the Monitor came in between it and initiate the conflict. It was a draw. Both were slugging away at each other, and everything that they fired at each other just simply bounced off their hulls. And so the conflict was a standstill or a stalemate. In no decision here, but it did change the nature of naval warfare. All right. The next ones on our list here are all italicized, so these are big ones here. So Gettysburg, 1863, occurs in Pennsylvania, It's in blue, so it's going to be a United States victory here, and we have it as a turning point. Again, after Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee takes his Army of Northern Virginia into the United States and crosses into Pennsylvania, out of the border regions into Pennsylvania. His goal was to kind of demoralize the United States, eventually find his way to Harrisburg and take out a rail link in the United States, and then potentially surround Washington, D.C. Well, he gets stopped at Gettysburg. The United States will engage in a 3-day conflict with Robert E. Lee. This is one of the first conflicts that, or early conflicts that you can say repeating rifles are being used. They have been experimented in some of the other battles, but this one used by Union cavalry, and so it was a game changer on the first day. On the second day, the United States is going to be able to withstand, I should say, several Confederate charges that could have pretty much ended the conflict altogether, not just at Gettysburg, at the big Civil War. It is on that day, another Civil War fact here, the Minnesota 1st Regiment valiantly stood its ground, and unfortunately it would suffer about 82% casualties, but is credited as saving the day for the United States. So the Minnesota boys held their own there. And then on the third day, the United States withheld a valiant charge by General Pickett, and that also ended in a defeat, though, or similar to some of the other charges that ultimately led to the defeat of Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg. First time Robert E. Lee really suffers a huge setback. Yeah, Antietam was, but Gettysburg is perhaps even a greater setback in there. The invincibility that he had or he believed in his army, it's now vulnerable here. But it's not a knockout blow. They are able to get back to Virginia to fight for another day. So that's a key point there. For the United States, it definitely is a turning point. The tide is turning in favor of the United States. It kind of secures their position in the international world, in that the Confederacy is not going to be recognized. The European powers are not going to intervene in any way here. So it's big in that point. But for the Union General Meade, he is going to get criticized for not pursuing Lee and knocking him out, and so he's going to be replaced, and he's going to be replaced eventually by the victor in the next conflict, which is Vicksburg, and that's going to be Grant. All right, so now we look at Vicksburg here. And Vicksburg, one could argue, it's a bigger conflict than Gettysburg, but is overshadowed, maybe because Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address, and so therefore Vicksburg is more second, it plays second fiddle to Gettysburg here. So Vicksburg is located in Mississippi. The president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, he considered it the Gibraltar of the South here, and so that's going to be a big one. It is on the Mississippi River, and so it's at a critical junction point for the railroads, in that from Vicksburg it goes into the western territories of the Confederacy, so it's important there. It's a large city, very important, and it's from the great state of Mississippi, which is home of the Confederate president of Jefferson Davis, so it's going to be important piece here. The United States is going to be able to get it. It's going to take a little bit longer than Gettysburg. Gettysburg 3-day battle, July 1st to the 3rd. Vicksburg concludes on July 4th of 1863, but actually started in November of 1862. Vicksburg is going to represent a new style of warfare, kind of seen in the Crimean conflict a decade earlier, but this one is all about siege mentality. using big guns, using large resources, using the uh, the new ironclads, basically just reducing Vicksburg, and ultimately General Pemberton is knocked out at Vicksburg. This is a big one in that it splits the Confederacy in half. So it's going to allow the United States to lay claim to all of the Mississippi River, which is going to be critical, and then knocks out Pemberton's forces altogether. And so this is a knockout blow where Gettysburg was not. And it launches Grant into national prominence, and he's going to be promoted to the Eastern Theater and head of the Army of the Potomac, which is considered like the main army of the United States. Okay, the Atlanta campaign and Sherman's March to the Sea represents total war. William Tecumseh Sherman takes over as the commander of the United States forces in the Western Theater, and their objective is to take Atlanta and then eventually get to the sea and then move up and meet up with Grant in perhaps in Virginia, and so they can do that knockouts. That's kind of the big scheme here. Atlanta is important in that it's the last big city in the South that hasn't fallen outside of Virginia, and it's a manufacturing center. It's a rail hub, so it's a critical piece here. And so by 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman is able to defeat the Confederates at Atlanta. And so when Atlanta falls, it actually coincides with the election of Abraham Lincoln, and it's kind of secures his election with that victory. And then he takes this war to the next level when he does his Sherman's March to the Sea, and so that represents this idea of war of attrition here, and that totally wants to demoralize the southern the southerner here. In that if you couldn't take it, you burned it. If you couldn't eat it at that moment, you killed it, so no one else could. Uh, it basically, he had let his army feed off the land here, and they made Georgia hull. They burned whatever they came in contact. Chimneys standing where structures used to be were known as Sherman pipes or Sherman chimneys. Rail ties that were superheated and then bent were known as Sherman's ties. So he really took the war to the people, and it had a psychological effect. Petersburg campaign, very similar to Sherman's March to the Sea. It's going to be a total war here, 1864, 1865. The key to Petersburg, or why you need to take down Petersburg, is that it is really the city that guards Richmond, and Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy. And so when Petersburg does fall, and again, it's a total war campaign, and Grant is now, again, the general of the Eastern armies here, and once Petersburg falls, the Confederate government does leave Richmond. They flee, as well as the Confederate presidency and his cabinet flee Richmond, Virginia, because it's just a matter of a few days that Richmond becomes occupied. The war itself, for all practical purposes, comes to an end at Appomattox Courthouse, which is also in Virginia here. And this is where Robert E. Lee ultimately surrenders to Grant. And so the Army of Northern Virginia is no longer in the field. Grant is no longer in, Lee is no longer in the field. Grant accepts the surrender. And then ultimately, when Sherman accepts Joe Johnston's surrender, then the war is really, all practical purposes, is over, is done. So when we look at the role of foreign powers in this conflict, the Confederacy was making a big effort to try to get the Confederates, or try to get foreign recognition and foreign resources. That could have been a game changer, but in reality, um, no foreign powers recognized. They did give some resources, and so therefore you can make a claim that foreign powers did not play a significant role in determining the outcome of this particular civil war. All right, so taking a look at Britain, because that's the big one here being spotlighted. Of course, France, Russia is in there as well, but Great Britain is the big one here. And when it comes to who to support, the Confederacy or the Union, there are two ways of thinking here. When we look at those that are sympathetic for the Confederacy, they simply look at it as from a self-interest perspective here. They just want to see the United States go down. They're tired of it, the attitude of the United States, and it kind of was a symbol of embarrassment for them, so that they would celebrate to see it go down. Strong economic links, mainly because of the cotton and its connection to their textile industry, key. The Union had no right to force an unpopular government on the people, so they flipped the colonial argument we had against them on us. And slavery did not seem to be a critical issue. So some thought, well, slavery might be morally wrong, but at the end of the day, they can live with it as long as business is business. Sympathy for the Union here is that if they did go to conflict with the United States, that perhaps Canada would be lost. All right, so therefore, let's stay on good terms with the United States, and Canada can exist, and ultimately, it kind of does fast track Canada's road to independence. Loss of valuable markets and investments as well, just similar to what some might have thought about cotton to the textile. The United States has had a vibrant trade with Great Britain beyond just textile, and so it could have been perhaps even a greater loss of that particular market. Slave issue was the heart of it, and so again, that was a big issue for some in the British government, as well as the Queen of England, Victoria. It was big, so that in some ways overshadows a lot of their thinking. Fighting a war thousands of miles away from home was difficult, as proven with the American Revolution and the War of 1812. So best, at the end of the day, be neutral. And so on May 1861, they did declare themselves neutral, and it was whether or not they looked at this war as a war or a rebellion. A war, there is some legitimacy to it. A rebellion shows that it's more of internal conflict, and so might want to stay away from that. They did recognize the Union blockade, and so they felt the United States met the international standard for a blockade. They did not view the Confederacy as a sovereign state, and so as a result of that, they don't get some of the perks that goes along with being an independent state here. But they did accept the Confederacy's belligerent status, that status that they're in a conflict, which means it could turn into loans and supplies here. Okay. To continue this a little bit, with the Confederate and Union diplomacy, the cotton embargo forced Great Britain and France to recognize. What that really means is that the Confederacy had placed an embargo on the cotton, and they were trying to get Great Britain and France to recognize them, play into this economic hand here that cotton is king. However, there was a cotton famine, and that was only temporary. And cotton was now found in other places like in India, China, and Egypt. So the textile factories in France and in Great Britain found a alternative source, and so that kind of undercut the importance of uh, of cotton, and as well as recognizing the Confederacy here. I already mentioned the Trent Affair, 61 and 62. Mason and Slidell were those Confederate ministers that were taken prisoners, but ultimately released here. Uh, and after that, the United States Secretary of State William Seward tried to find a way, as well as Henry Adams, tried to find ways to, in some ways, placate Great Britain and France to prevent them from engaging in supporting the Confederacy. The commerce raiders were a nuisance. The Confederacy were able to get some commerce raiders, probably the most famous one being the CSA Alabama here. They ran the blockades and were able to get some supplies into the Confederacy here. And so the United States Navy was trying to find ways to take care of that. The United States was able to stop the Confederacy from getting the Laird rams of 1863. Great Britain was going to supply them to the Confederates, but enough international pressure was put on, so the Laird rams would not go into the hands of the Confederacy. If that would have happened, that definitely would have been a game changer. They would have been able to destroy the United States blockade. But that is a what if now. France did seem to be, Napoleon III did seem to be sympathetic to the Confederacy. The concern was economics. It was about cotton, but at the end of the day, they found themselves being more occupied by their attempts to make Mexico part of a new French empire, that they were distracted, and they focused on Mexico, which ultimately turned to be a disaster for them. Russia, on the other hand, was sympathetic to the U.S. only to counter Great Britain and France. It's the old balance of power theory. Russia was trying to find a way to keep their importance in the European community here, and so they were only sympathetic to the United States for that particular reason. In the end, for the Confederacy, no recognition from any European nation. All right, so I'll wrap this up here. When we look at the impact of the war, several things is decided here as a result of this war. One, slavery does end. 13th Amendment, end slavery. Second, the United States had become a federal union, which goes back to that political contract theory here, and the supremacy of the federal government. And then the Republican agenda that Abraham Lincoln had platformed on in the 1860 election comes into play here. We have a new tariff, which is a little bit higher, Homestead Act of 1862, which is a liberal land or very open land policy. The Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862 set up universities in the West. Pacific Railway Act of 1862 is going to allow for the expansion of railroads out west and create that eventually that transcontinental railroad. Of course, the Banking Act of 1863 starting to create a more federal banking system around the United States, and most importantly here, a loose immigration policy, bring more people in, develop the West, because this war is not going to last forever, and so we can get that West developed, and then now the United States can turn into that industrial juggernaut. So that is it for the U.S. Civil War. The next recording is going to focus on how we put this thing all back together, and we're going to call it Reconstruction. Until then, take care.